iHeartRadio presents Podversations, a weekly discussion with the biggest names and influencers in podcasting.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming back and joining us for what is very honestly my favorite half hour of the week, where I get to sit down and have a conversation with creators in this amazing industry that I get to work in called podcasting. We spend this 30 minutes every week talking to some creators in our own network, some folks outside our company that we admire. We tried to do this across the whole year as we've all gone into a very interesting year and quarantine and not been able to hang out with each other as much. And I think it's sort of kept us abreast of what's happening in podcasting. That's continued to be this just exploding, incredible new medium that great creators like the ones we get to talk to today are working in. We announced recently a partnership with an incredible new-ish podcast network called Pushkin Industries. It's from Malcolm Gladwell and Jacob Weisberg. We announced this a couple weeks ago. We are incredibly excited and proud to be in partnership with Pushkin. And I have the great fun and privilege and honor to talk to Malcolm and Jacob today for a half an hour. Malcolm, Jacob, first of all, thank you guys so much for hanging out with us for a half hour to talk through some stuff.
Not at all.
Thank you, Conal. I should say we're super excited about this partnership too, and I'm only sorry that we can't do some version of this in person and meet your team. But this is next best thing.
Awesome. Okay, let's jump in. So it's not like I think we need to break the ice, but why not? With a couple questions, Malcolm, I will start with you. Been a very kind of weird year indeed, and we're all spending like a lot more time inside. I think actually more time with media. I know that usually I spend maybe a week, 2-3 weeks, a month watching a show on my favorite streaming platforms. These days, I'll binge a show in like 2 or 3 days. My latest was Killing Eve. What are you binging? What are you watching?
Every show that you would expect. Just finishing up Queen's Gambit, or just finished Queen's Gambit last night. I did Emily in Paris. That's how happy I am to indulge my something or other. But I've done like Jiri Haji was one of my favorites of the year. I could go on. I mean, it's been one after. I've consumed more media in the last 8 months than at any other point in my life. It's kind of been extraordinary.
Yeah, I think I've actually climbed to the peak of peak content. Why Queen's Gambit? Like, why is this the #1 trending show on all the things that trend shows?
Don't ask me. I watched it because other people were watching. I've become a total Netflix sheep. I just go to what they say I should watch. I don't even question it anymore.
Yeah, same as me. I was like, well, it's trending. I guess I should keep it trending, maybe. Jacob, over to you. What book are you reading to get much more sophisticated about this?
Yeah, I mean, just noted you asked Malcolm what TV he's watching and me what I'm reading, which is about par for the course. Well, I watch all the same TV Malcolm does, of course, because I just say, Malcolm, what are you watching? And then I watch the same stuff. But I am reading, to be further on trend, I've just started Obama's memoir, A Promised Land, which so far, and I'm not very far into it, I would say is only the second high quality post-presidential memoir in American history. And quiz question for both of you, what's the other one?
Oh.
You don't really have to guess, but the answer, interestingly, is Ulysses S. Grant, who wrote a fantastic post-presidential memoir that was so good that there was a persistent rumor it was ghostwritten by Mark Twain. Who didn't actually write it. Ulysses S. Grant wrote it, but Twain kind of coached him on it and gave him some editing help. Anyway, that's it points to what a good and real writer Obama is, that it's in that league. And it's fun to read because he's a real writer and it wasn't written by anybody but him.
That's really cool. That was on the tip of my tongue as my answer, by the way. Just let me get in a little bit into background. So like I've always said, like, I think one of the coolest things about the podcast medium is that it's new enough that I don't know anybody that started out in this medium as their job. They were all doing something before this. And I think it means that when you have meetings about developing a podcast, people bring crazy diverse experience to the table, whether it's TV, film, writing, or something else entirely that they were doing. Malcolm, what were you doing before you were a podcaster? And as a part two of that question, even now, like, how do you answer the question, what do you do for a living?
Well, I was writing for the New Yorker, writing books, giving talks, speeches. I've dropped the writing for the New Yorker. I now write audiobooks. I don't know if I'll write a print book again. And I still do some truncated version of the speaking gigs. So what do I say? I guess I say I'm a podcaster. People don't. I say that I'm in business with Jacob Weisberg. That's what I say. I think that's the best way to answer it.
I think Jacob Weisberg said he's in business with Jacob Weisberg. But let me drill into one thing before I go over to Jacob. When you say you won't do any more print books, just audiobooks, what's that about?
I think that for the kinds of stories I want to tell, audio is just better. So my last book, Talking to Strangers, we're now up to close to 1 million copies, audiobook copies, and 600 or 700,000 print copies. So the audiobook is well outsold the print book, and made me think, at a certain point, do I even need to worry about the print book? Why don't we have a large audio audience, and audio allows you to tell a story in such a compelling, emotionally powerful way. And if I was only doing it as an audiobook, I would do a different kind of book. And that different kind of book is actually the kind of book I think I want to write now. So I might have written my last print book.
And I don't mean to rabbit hole on this so early in the conversation, but like, I read a book as a kid. I build an imaginary world in my head off the text. But you're saying audio allows you to maybe do certainly something different, but maybe even something more than that. Maybe just talk through that a little bit. What does audio drive in the human sort of theater of the mind, all this terminology we use that maybe you don't get from just quote unquote print?
Well, you get emotion. You give up on analytical. Really hard to do a lot of numbers when you're talking or deal with some complicated theory. But on the plus side, you get emotion. You get just hearing. There's certain kinds of voices where, like I'm going to name drop. Is it okay if I name drop?
Please.
Yesterday for a project we're working on, I interviewed Sting, who is like, one of the 5 most charismatic human beings of the last 100 years. You kind of have to hear Sting. Yeah. Like, you don't want to read a transcript of what he said. And then Sting said, I really like that track. No. When you hear him and he's like just being super Sting-like, and he's being hilarious, and he's making these little asides, and he, starts to sing something. I mean, you got to hear that, right? So At a certain point, you have to say to yourself, do I want to give people the real experience, or do I want to just kind of do a lousy version of it on the page?
According to the last person who updated the internet, the first job you tried to get was in advertising, and you would not get hired anywhere. You applied to all these companies. You were a youngster, I assume, fresh out of college. Is this story true?
28 rejection letters, which I posted on the wall of on my dorm room wall.
Why? What were you doing so wrong in these interviews? Like, what happened?
I never even got interviews. Rejected outright. I got one interview, and years later, the Conal advertising conference every year. Yeah. I got invited to speak at Conal, and I told the story about how I got rejected 28 times, and then I said, when you guys go back, please look through the piles on your desk, because I'm quite convinced my resume is down there somewhere.
And I'm still looking. Jacob, what was your first job out of college?
I started working in journalism right after college. I think my first one was at Newsweek, and I spent the summer after college in the Washington Bureau, which was a lot of fun. I was already very focused then on having a career as a journalist covering politics, which I did for a long time until I got into podcasting.
Your last job before being a full-time podcaster?
Well, I was running Slate. I was had been the editor-in-chief, and then I was sort of the CEO. I became more and more responsible for that. But it was sort of a dual role because I had founded a company that changed its name to Megaphone, what was originally called Panoply, and was recently in the news because a company that shall be nameless acquired it for a lot of money. And interestingly, I'd started Panoply, as it was then known, as a content company, something a little more like Pushkin. Pushkin was like, but I wasn't the CEO, I wasn't running it, and it kind of got away from me. It somehow turned into a technology company when I'd meant to have, I'd started this podcast with Malcolm, which I thought was a pretty good idea. And anyway, one thing led to another, but we decided to try to get it right the second time.
Did you, so again, in the interest of, is the person that last updated the internet accurate? Did you, you're an undergrad, I think, at Yale. Did you really decline to become a member of the Skull and Bones group, and why?
That is a true story. I'm not sure why that's on the Wikipedia page. I prefer to have the things I did do as opposed to things I didn't do. But they didn't have women at the time. And I thought, if I say no, this is a chance to impress my girlfriend and my mom with the same action. You don't get many shots like that. So, and it worked. They were both impressed that I turned them down.
I think that's a pretty cool thing to have on your Wikipedia page, I gotta say. Malcolm, back over to you real quick. So I actually, in maybe slightly more seriously, I think that this year in particular, being a tougher year than most for a lot of us, I think it's an important year, particularly for your voice. I think if I could oversimplify the heck out of your approach, you make us look at familiar things differently. You make us sort of question settled truths, assumptions. Your first book, The Tipping Point, started in part because of your interest in epidemiologists, how they looked at the world, especially as far as the AIDS epidemic went. How did you think about that this year? Like, do you think still about epidemiologists? Is it a year where you're like, I just wish I could give them all a big hug, or angry at them? Like, what do you know about them that maybe we could learn?
I have thought about them, and I've thought about them a lot because many of the same names who I knew back in when I used to cover HIV for AIDS for the Washington Post, many of the same people I was writing about and talking to are now in the center of COVID, chief among them, Tony Fauci. I mean, Pushkin actually published a Fauci book by my former Washington Post and New Yorker colleague, Michael Spector. Michael and I were we're together. We knew Fauci back, we call him and all that, and many of these other names pop up again. So it's a familiar territory, ground for me. I guess I do think about it a fair amount. I think about how this group of people always get marginalized. So we listen to them in these brief windows when there's a crisis, like year 3 and 4 of the AIDS epidemic, and then we listen to them around COVID. But there's a 30-year stretch between those two events when they're off in the wilderness again. Nobody much cares about them. It's a very strange kind of profession to have, where you alternate between brief periods where the world will hang on your every word and long stretches where the world cuts off all your funding and doesn't, care even remotely what you have to say.
Yeah, it's interesting. You and I were talking about before we went live on this webinar about the CDC. I live right near the CDC, and I have friends who work there. And I think this isn't their terminology, but they feel like the extreme version of a fair weather friend, where it's like, oh, now you'd like to talk. And I think that's a good sort of summary of how they probably feel in a year like 2020. But more personally for you, so you're born in Jamaica, grew up in Canada.
Born in England.
Born in England.
My mom's Jamaican.
Mom is Jamaican. Born in England. Born in England. Mom is Jamaican. Grew up in Canada. Now live in the States. In a year like 2020, do you feel more passionately American than ever, where you want us to get it more right than we have in the past, or do you feel more like an outsider than ever, where you're like, not my problems? Like, where do you land?
Well, the great virtue of having multiple nationalities to choose from is that I get to switch depending on what's most in my self-interest at the moment. So I've been for most of the last 4 years, I've been a Canadian.
It's like, I was thinking about this when people say I'm moving to Canada. I was like, Malcolm may literally want to move to Canada.
Well, just so you know, during the Olympics, when you see two Olympics ago, when Usain Bolt was winning all those, I was Jamaican then. So on
that day I was born in Jamaica. Thank you very much.
It changes.
Jacob,
it's called nationalistic opportunism.
Exactly. Jacob, back over to you on getting more into podcasting. So you and Malcolm launched this thing called Pushkin Industries. I think it's fair to say it roars onto the scene in what's already a hot medium, podcasting, that's now at almost 100 million Americans a month listening to a podcast. Here comes Pushkin Industries. Now, granted, neither one of you are newbies to podcasting. Malcolm, you host a couple incredible shows like Revisionist History. Jacob, you told us about your history, whether it's Megaphone or the Slate Panoply podcast, incredible backgrounds. But I'm interested in that moment where you and Malcolm are sitting together. If this moment exists, maybe it's just my mythology wanting it to be, where you actually look at each other and say, you know what, we should launch a podcast network. Let's actually do this. What's that moment like? What drove that?
Well, I can describe the actual moment. We were on summer vacation in Italy. I was renting a house. Malcolm was visiting us from somewhere else. He was staying in Italy. And he came down to breakfast, and I was already down at breakfast having a cup of coffee. And I said, Malcolm, why don't we just start a podcast company? And he said, sure, let's do it. And that was then we talked about it for a little bit. But I think it came out of a lot of different things, but more than anything else, the success we'd had with Revisionist History, how much Malcolm was enjoying it, how well it was working, and just I think a combination of the storytelling opportunity, which we were both really reveling in, the things you could do there that you couldn't do in other media, but also that there was a real commercial opportunity. And I worked for many years in journalism in what I call the no profit sector, and it was kept Slate alive for a long time, and but Slate, like a lot of other high quality magazines on and offline, have always struggled, and it was a kind of marginal existence. And I think part of what was exciting about podcasting was the business really seemed to work, and that combination made me excited about starting a new company.
Why Pushkin? Where'd that name come from?
I'll let Malcolm do that one.
Well, there's the pretentious answer and the non-pretentious answer. Pushkin, of course, is a famous Russian poet, and also biracial, and so he's a very appropriate role model for me. But the actual reason is that our first dog was a lab German Shepherd mutt, who my dad called Pushkin, dubbed Pushkin. And everything since then, everything in my life I call Pushkin. I got 5 different Pushkins. I call for a while I called my apartment Pushkin, and so the Pushkins have just multiplied. This is the latest iteration of the Pushkin meme in my life.
I think we could get that trending, sort of like Queen's Gambit. I don't know. I'm doing a Pushkin at noon on Thursday with iHeartRadio. Malcolm, what was that moment like for you? Breakfast in Italy. You're talking with Jacob. He's like, you know what? Let's launch a podcast network. Was there a party that was like, I'm good, or were you all in?
I was in. Jacob summoned me. I was on a holiday with my family, and he said, "You have to come. I have something I want to talk to you about." So I fly down to Italy, and Jacob from France, and Jacob normally his wife has exquisite taste. So I was expecting this villa like overlooking some mountainside. I mean, I really thought I was gonna. Turns out they had rented this pokey little place by the side of the road. I was like, what on earth is happening? And then, but I come down one morning at Jacob, and I thought, why not? I mean, I had been saying to Jacob for years that I thought he was, although I think he's a brilliant journalist, I always thought he would be a better businessman. I don't know why I just thought that. And it turns out to be true, by the way. But anyway, so I thought I was delighted. It was like, how much fun. And also it's an excuse to spend time with your friend. I mean,
yeah.
What better use of your time?
And Jacob, but besides the business model of this, what was sort of the editorial mandate or mission that you had in mind when you were like, let's actually launch a company around this? Was there an editorial goal too of like, I'd like to make this kind of content?
Yeah, I think so. So much of podcasting, at least the sort of high end of it, comes out of the world of public radio. And they have certain style and certain values. And, they're very, producers really drive things. But I was really interested in working with authors because I'm an author myself, and as a magazine editor, I'd always worked with authors. And I thought it was such interesting sort of alchemy you got when you put someone like Malcolm, who never worked in audio before, when you tried to make a podcast with him, and it was just very, very different. Just sounds really different from Radio Lab or This American Life or lots of the signature shows of public radio and podcasting. And then I brought in Michael Lewis to do a podcast, and we're doing a podcast with Jill Lepore. And what I was finding was these writers who were pretty well along in their careers got so excited about working in a new medium because of the storytelling potentialities that they never had. And it was what you were talking about a minute ago, the way people's imaginations are triggered by listening as opposed to just reading, or as opposed to video. I love this. One of the books I wrote back in the day was a biography of Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan, of course, got his start in radio and was very savvy about this. And after Ronald Reagan, a little bit of political history, if you don't mind, ran for president and lost in 1976. He was the leader of the Republican Party, but out of office. And he got offered the job of being the nightly editorial commentator on CBS News, which was the biggest news program in the United States. No better editorial platform. And he turned it down in favor of doing a syndicated radio show. And he said his reason was, when people see you all the time, they get tired of looking at you. But when they hear your voice and don't see you, they use their own imaginations. And it's a real thing. People engage actively with the disembodied voice in a way they don't with any other medium. And that's sort of, I think, what people who start working in it for the first time experience, and why people are so into it.
Do you think that carries over into, just to get into more of the business side of this for a second, does that carry over into why podcasts perform so freaking well for advertisers? Is it because you have a sort of one-to-one relationship, immersive relationship with your listener? I don't mean to lead the witness, but the data bears this out again and again. Podcast ad campaigns perform better than most other media. People don't skip podcast ads. It is actually pretty compelling. Do you think it's all part of that same engagement?
I mean, let's just put it bluntly. It's the only medium in which people don't hate the ads. Everywhere else, ads are like a tax on the content. You gotta absorb it. You're required to do it, or maybe you can get out of it by skipping it or leaving the room. TV. On podcasts, people have the option to skip the ads, and to an incredible degree don't. And if you listen, I mean, Malcolm, he talked about his being a frustrated ad man, but he has such a good time doing the ads, and I always say they're in danger of upstaging the content of his show. They're enjoyable to listen to, and I'm not sure you need to say anything more than that. People want to listen to the ads. The ads are going to be more effective than they are in other media where people don't want to absorb the ads.
Malcolm, how do you think about ads? I mean, I remember like literally to Jacob's point, listening to revisionist history, but then also one of the things I remember the best are some ad reads you did because they were super funny and super creative. How do you approach those with sort of your brain space? Are you like, you think a ton about how does it go?
Well, there's a certain kind of ad I love doing, which is the tongue-in-cheek one. There's some sense of mischief, and what's happened, I've long been I love advertising. Why I wanted to go into it as a kid, and I'm a sort of a student of ads. And one of the things I've noticed is that I feel like lately in a lot of establishment ads, television commercials and such, a little bit of the fun has been drained out of it. There used to be, maybe I'm wrong, a lot more kind of mischief and humor and goofiness and chance taking. I was thinking about recently about remember the ad Spike Lee did for Nike back in the day?
Oh yeah.
There's nothing like that on television right now. And I think with podcasting, there's an opportunity to go back to that sort of magical period, because the audience doesn't have a narrow and strict definition of what they expect an ad to be. They'll take anything. They're like along for the ride. And I think it's a shame not to exploit that. Can I share my favorite ad I ever did? There's a bunch of them, but one of them was for Hotels Tonight, where it was all about Psycho, and I've forgotten the name of the actress. So the woman is she's fleeing from some criminal who's out to get her, and she's looking for a place to, she's driving, it's raining, it's dark, she needs a hotel to stay at. Her only choice is the Bates Hotel. And the whole point of the ad is like, if she only had Hotel Tonight, she wouldn't have to stay in a hotel with a psycho.
I remember it. Janet Leigh. I totally remember. I think that, and by the way, Jacob, I totally agree. Writers as podcasters, just to not overlook that. We've launched a show called Committed. We launched a show called Family Secrets. We've launched a show called Before Breakfast, all with established, well-selling writers. And these are some of the best shows we've launched. I think the writers bring in a rigor to their prep and their storytelling that is pretty unique. I think that's at least a little bit where podcasting has come from, especially in the last year. A lot of that's thanks to you guys bringing a lot of really awesome writers into the medium. But Malcolm, I'm interested to get your take on where do you think the medium's going? Maybe we'll spend the last 2.5 minutes here just talking about that. Obviously, true crime for a long time dominated podcasting. And maybe it's like a two-sided question. Why do you think that is? Why do you think true crime is the genre of the last decade or so since serial and podcasting? But also, like, what are you excited about next? Like, what's another genre that podcasting could tackle, thinking, I think what limits us a lot in podcasting, or at least has for the last 10 years, is like, well, that's kind of a visual genre. We better not go there. But we're seeing things like food and travel start to jump. What do you, maybe those two questions, why crime and where next?
Well, crime, because crime is always, think about television.
Yeah.
Law and Order, and the true crime is just our staple. I even think about, I'm someone who reads enormous numbers of thrillers, so I just feel that for some reason the human mind loves that particular genre. So that has never surprised me. In terms of where this, my suspicion is that in podcasting, a lot of the kind of arbitrary institutional barriers that separate things are going to break down. So a podcast can, the lines between books and podcasts, the lines between, commentary and narration, the lines, all these kinds of things. I think we call ourselves an audio company because we sort of think that almost anything can be an audio product, right? There isn't this narrow thing called a podcast. It's just a kind of way to reach people. And as long as you're saying something they want to hear, there's no reason you can't do a food show. There's no reason you can't do a travel show. The same way, like if I'm just talking to you about my vacation, if I tell a good enough story, you'll listen. You don't need to see a visual of where I went. Right. Why should it be any different in a podcast?
Yeah. And so, Jacob, over to you for the last question. So we've announced this big partnership with you guys, not just to grow your audiences as best we can, to drive revenue for you through great advertising partnerships, but also to make a lot of new content with you guys, right? A big part of our partnership is a co-production slate of cool new shows we're going to launch. What do you think is next for Pushkin? How do you want to use those resources? What kind of content in particular are you like, oh, awesome, now I can make this kind of stuff?
Well, I think it's really an opportunity for us to branch out, and I think we haven't even formally started yet, but we've already been, throwing ideas at you and vice versa. And so we see it as a really creative partnership. beyond the sales side. We're excited to try things. I think we're experimenters by nature, and we just want to make sure that everything we do is a really smart and good version of what it's trying to be. One of our next launches, which is we have some shows already in the pipeline, is a true kind of our first true crime show called Lost Hills, which we're doing with Dana Goodyear, an amazing New Yorker writer. And it wasn't that we weren't turning up our nose at true crime, but because there's so much of it, we feel like it just raises the bar for us in terms of how good something has to be. We think we finally got it with this show. But we're talking to you guys about a whole range of stuff, and I wouldn't take anything off the table.
Awesome. Listen, guys, I know you are busy. I know you have a lot of other stuff going on in your lives, not to mention, growing this incredible podcast company that you've launched. I really do appreciate you taking a half hour to talk to me during the week and letting people listen in on it. It means a lot to us. The trust that you've put into iHeart with this partnership. We're going to make some awesome stuff together. Really appreciate that too. Thank you very much for joining us today for this thing.
Thank you, Conal. This was great. Really a pleasure.
Awesome. Everybody, thank you so much for listening in. Please check in. We will send out a notice about the next one we do and who it's with, but it's going to be hard to beat. I really appreciate you guys joining us again. Everybody stay safe and take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Podversations is a production of iHeartRadio. You can find more from the biggest names in podcasting on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.